serves as adjunct faculty for Catholic Studies at the College of Liberal Arts and Science at DePaul, and she currently teaches a course for undergraduates on notable Vincentian women, Elizabeth Bailey Seaton. At this point, I don't want to take up any more of her time, so
I'll go ahead and start with the prayer.
That would be great.
Okay. So just as something to get us, as we always start everything Vincentian with a prayer, I'd like to go ahead and start with this one. Dear Lord and Father of all, thank you for today. Thank you for ways in which you provide for us all. For your protection and love, we thank you. Help us to focus our hearts and minds now on what we are about to learn. Inspire us by your Holy Spirit as we listen and see. Guide us by your eternal light as we discover more about the world around us. We ask all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. So at this point, I'd like to invite Sister BettyAnn.
I'm just going to mute. Have we muted everyone? I'm going to mute everybody.
Right.
And then, so sister, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen and Claudia. Am I muted or am I?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm happy to be with y'all from misty, chilly, almost snowy Chicago. I want to share with you stories of Elizabeth Seaton. I call this From the Heart of a Friend because Elizabeth Seaton, to me, is a friend. I met her when I was a youngster. I read an early biography of her and was fascinated because her father called her Betty, and of course, I was BettyAnn. But more than that, she lived by the sea, the Long Island Sound, and I lived a block from the Atlantic Ocean. We had a lot in common. She lost a parent at a very young age, and so had I. So I found many things in common, and I got to know her more and more. And over the years, as a teenager, I was invited to what we would call a youth day today, but in those days, it was called a Marian Congress. So I was standing right in Emmitsburg, where she lived and worked, right beside the graves of her daughters and her own. When the bells started to toll, that meant that Pope John XXIII had declared her Blessed Elizabeth Ann Seaton. And of course, she was made venerable because I was one of the children that signed a petition that went to Rome with the Ladies of Charity. So I've just always known her. And after I entered the Daughters of Charity, her canonization was announced and we could submit our names if we wanted to go. Well, who wouldn't want to go on a free trip to Europe, much less to a canonization of Mother Seaton? And I was one of the youngest ones chosen. Well, so I've been telling her story for the last 50 years. So I'm happy to share pieces of it with you today. To encapsulate it all, Elizabeth Seaton was born at the era of our American Revolution, and her family were loyalists to Great Britain. Her father fought for the other side, not the Americans. She was a wife, a widow, a mother of 5, and a very devout Episcopalian who converted to Roman Catholicism. She is the one who incarnated the Vincentian charism first in North America. The Vincentian priests, the Congregation of the Mission, had not arrived. There were no Daughters of Charity. It was Mother Seaton who got the Vincentian rule, the rule of the Daughters of Charity from France. Kindness of the Sulpician priest. And she enculturated that and instilled it in her early Sisters of Charity. So I hope that in telling her story, you'll get a little sense of not the Elizabeth Seaton that you see in the stained glass window or the one you see on a pedestal in marble, but of a young woman who was born to a physician and a daughter of an Episcopalian priest on Staten Island, who had a baby sister, but her mother died, probably as a result of childbirth. So Elizabeth's father was the sole parent of two girls, a 6-year-old and a younger child, Elizabeth, 2, and a newborn infant. After a year, he remarried. He married a 19-year-old woman who had lost her mother as an adolescent and probably hadn't had a lot of nurturing. And Elizabeth, who her father called Betsy or Betty, and her sister Mary were not really happy about a stepmother descending into their family, and it didn't go smoothly. Within a year, Betsy's little sister died. We don't know what the cause was, but Elizabeth Seaton did a lot of journaling and wrote in a memoir that we have. It says her first memory was of sadness and sitting on the stoop outside the porch. And people said, "Aren't you sad that your baby sister is in there in the coffin, going to be buried?" And she said, "No, I want to go up to heaven with Mama and Kitty." So she had an understanding that things were good in heaven, God was good in heaven, but she had a deep pain in her heart for the loss of her mother, whom she had known, and of her baby sister. That sadness, that thread of sadness permeates her entire life. Her father was an aspiring physician and went to England to study medicine, but didn't want to leave his oldest daughters with stepmother and new children that were being born. So he sent Elizabeth, or Betsy, and her sister Mary to New Rochelle, New York, to live with his brother and his wife, in other words, her aunt and uncle. They lived on a farm in New Rochelle, and it was just kind of an ideal place right by the Long Island Sound. And the young girl enjoyed roaming along the sand dunes, walking along the seashore. She discovered nature, its fragility and its beauty, and she enjoyed playing with her cousins. And it was just a very, very nurturing environment, but she missed her father greatly. And with the childish mind, wondered if he'd gone away and he didn't love her anymore. Just like she may have wondered, as some children do, did I do something to make my mother die or the kitty, the baby, die? So Dr. Bailey came back for a while, and then he went back to England. So the girls went back to New Rochelle. During this time, Betsy was becoming an adolescent and was going through what I would say was probably a mild, maybe not so mild, but an adolescent depression. Whatever triggered it, she did consider taking laudanum, which we would say a drug overdose. But in her memoir, she says she's so grateful that she didn't do the horrid deed. Laudanum is a medicine, a substance that is used for colicky babies to calm them down. It's like a cocaine derivative. So we have a youngster who's lost her mom. She's in a blended family and not happy. She's living with relatives. Her father is away. And eventually he comes back, picks up the two girls. They go to Manhattan and settle, and he leaves his second wife permanently, more or less permanently, but there were some more children that still came, but the marriage was over. In that period of time of living in Lower Manhattan with her father, who was growing in prominence in the medical community, she met tall, dark, and handsome William McGee Seaton from a mercantile family, whereas all of Elizabeth's relatives were physicians in the medical field. And William McGee Seaton fell in love with Betsy Bailey. He called her my Eliza. We do have some of their love letters, her notes to him about where he could meet her and what time, and don't be late. They're very quaint and poignant. They did marry. They married for love. They didn't marry for wealth. They married for love. The Seaton family was involved with an import-export business, as I mentioned, mercantile. And Elizabeth first had a daughter and then a son. And then suddenly, William McGee's father had fallen on ice in January of 1798 and languished until June. He died in June. Elizabeth was almost 9 months pregnant. Because Mr. Seaton had died, his wife had predeceased him. In fact, he had been widowed twice. And after the first wife died, he married his sister-in-law. So Elizabeth and William McGee, he was the oldest of 13 children of both marriages of his father. They had to take in the youngest Seatons, which were 6 or 7 of them, because they were orphaned. Elizabeth was ready to give birth. She was having a difficult pregnancy. And when she finally did go into labor, it was a very difficult, complicated delivery. Her father was there and the infant was born not breathing. So Dr. Bailey did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and revived the child, whom they named after his grandfather, Richard Bailey. And as soon as Elizabeth recovered, she said she almost lost she did lose her eyesight for several weeks. And as soon as she was able, and the infant was able, both two families came together, living on near Wall Street. Originally, Elizabeth and William McGee had lived on Wall Street as neighbors of the Hamiltons, Alexander Hamilton. They married for love, and Elizabeth, with the new baby, said the simplest thing for her to do with all of these, her own children and these other children, she sent the older ones off to boarding school where they had been going, the girls and the boys, and she kept the youngest ones at home and started homeschooling. And that's when she discovered how much she enjoyed teaching children. I say that because it's Catholic Schools Week also. As the children aged, she had another daughter and then another daughter. But in the process, her husband, who was managing the family business, the Seaton Maitland Company, they were having financial problems, not the kind that we have necessarily, but there was an undeclared war on the Mediterranean, in the Mediterranean arena, and pirates were attacking shipping vessels and demanding money or taking whatever the ships were carrying. So the shipping firm was being left with more and more debt. William McGee was not as experienced in management as his father had been, but he also had inherited the gene or the weakness for tuberculosis through his mother. And he was beginning to show signs of tuberculosis and his health was failing. Elizabeth helped him, as like a secretary at home working on her laptop. Now, her laptop was a wooden little movable desk with a quill and paper. It was not electronic. They decided that the most important thing to do was to take care of Will's health. And they came up with what their neighbors and family thought was a crazy plan. But before I go into that crazy plan, I want to explain to you that Elizabeth and her sister-in-law and some of her friends, Elizabeth specifically was a co-founder with Isabella Graham of the Society to Aid Poor Widows with Young Children. And what they would do, they would go and make home visits, assess the situation, try to help the mother, and try to find some type of employment or some type of childcare for the children, etc. I know that must sound very Vincentian to you, but it was done in a Christian spirit without ever knowing about Vincent de Paul or Louise de Marillac. So Elizabeth was very involved with this, but as her husband's business began to fail, they decided they were going to take a voyage across the Atlantic for his health, because the sea air in Tuscany, Italy, was supposed to be ideal for respiratory problems. They did make that voyage. Unfortunately, when they arrived at the port of Livorno, Leghorn, Italy, the officials had just heard that New York had yellow fever. And when they saw the ill, feeble William McGee Seaton, they thought that's what he had. So what they did, they quarantined the family. The oldest daughter went with them in a stone lazaretto for 30 days. And when he was finally discharged from the cold, damp place on a mile out in the ocean that had no closed windows, etc., they took an apartment in Pisa, and there he died within 2 weeks. William McGee had visited Leghorn previously as a younger man. He knew the Felicki family. He had worked in their counting house, and the Felicki family befriended them and took Elizabeth in and the daughter and introduced them to the beauty of Italy, the cultural heritage, the cultural Catholic heritage of Italy. And that is where she first met the faith, where she experienced her first Catholic Mass, where she began to wonder about this devotion and religious experiences of these people, these Italians, and began to ask questions, first out of curiosity, and then out of interest. And the Felicki family could be compared to the RCIA of today. They were very, very knowledgeable about their faith. And so when she said in jest one time, in response to something that Filippo Felicki said, "Oh, you want me to be Catholic? You want me to be of your faith?" And he looked at her very seriously and just said, "All I ask is for you to pray and inquire." She prayed and she inquired, she studied, she was in an emotional turmoil for almost over a year when she returned to New York, because the Seatons were disown her if they knew that she was going to become Catholic. But she made the heart-wrenching decision and got a lot of advice, did a lot of research and study and praying and consulting, including John Carroll, who she said was like her spiritual father, Bishop John Carroll, the first bishop of the United States. And she made her profession of faith on March 14th, 1805 in St. Peter's Church on Berkeley Street, which is just a stone's throw from where the World Trade Center stood. And on the day, on the September 11th attack, that was the church that the firemen carried Father Michael Judge, the chaplain of the police and fire department, into St. Peter's Church and laid his corpse on the altar. And that is the church where Elizabeth made her profession of faith. And there still hangs a beautiful picture by a Mexican artist of the crucifixion that Elizabeth used to pray in front of. So I think I have rambled on from Elizabeth's birth until through her widowhood and her conversion, without really going into a lot of the details of her struggles to support herself, to survive, and to make that very difficult decision against all the people that had supported her. Her Episcopalian pastor and spiritual direction was dead set against her decision. She lost a lot of people. She lost in worldly terms, but she gained in spiritual terms in grace. So I think maybe we could entertain some questions for discussion. Claudia, if we have any at this point.
Or laudanum. Sorry.
Okay, if somebody wants to go ahead, I don't see anything in the chat right now, but if somebody wants to unmute themselves and ask the question. I thought I heard somebody wanting to do that.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say that that is the best story I've heard of any saint's life. Just so personal and so touching. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a question for you, sister. When she came back and did her conversion, did she, like any of her children or anything like that? Did she convert them, or what did she? Or am I running? I'm jumping ahead.
No, that's a very good question. After lots of research, it's been concluded that because Elizabeth Seaton was validly baptized in the Protestant Episcopal Church, validly baptized, she was not rebaptized. So at the time of her conversion, her oldest child would have been roughly 9 or 10. So all of the children were simply raised in the Catholic faith, and they had all been validly baptized as Episcopalians. So the Episcopal baptismal formula is the traditional Catholic one, and so it is recognized.
Okay, interesting. Shauna here, who's one of our formators of the district council, she mentioned that it fascinates her how all of our saints and co-founder women had such difficult childhoods, and very similar.
There's a lot of similarity between Louise de Marillac and Elizabeth Seaton. In fact, some articles have been written on that, which are available online to be downloaded from DePaul University, but I just don't have the actual address in my head at the moment.
Interesting. And I've got to ask, what brought you to this connection with Elizabeth?
Through my childhood, because when I came, I entered the Daughters of Charity, and our provincial house at that time was at Emmitsburg, where Elizabeth Seaton lived and died.
Right.
So I also went to the school, the college that was the successor to the school that she had founded. So I was on holy grounds for a few years. Then I was missioned back there. Then I was missioned back there for many years.
Excellent.
Can I ask one question? I know that you've written about the Seatonian kind of culture and the Vincentian culture. What are the similarities? What are the?
Well, we'll go into that in a little bit later on, but actually Elizabeth Seaton received the Vincentian rule. When I say Vincentian, I mean the rule of the Daughters of Charity from Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. And she formed her sisters in that spirit. So the communities that derive from the Emmitsburg Foundation have that spirit. And there are other communities that also have the Vincentian rule. But we're going to talk about that a little later on. To be Seatonian is to be Vincentian. To be Vincentian is not necessarily to be Seatonian, because there are many communities that were established in Europe. But the Seatonian ones were in North America, and that derives from the Vincentian rule, the Emmitsburg root.
I have a question. My mother's name was BettyAnn.
God bless her.
And my siblings claim that her parents, who were German Catholics in Missouri, probably had no idea who Elizabeth Ann Seaton was. It was just the name of another relative. Is that what you find? Most BettyAnns are just named after other relatives. It was a common name at one time, and they weren't named after Seaton.
I can't answer generically, but my parents were what they used to call a mixed marriage. My mother was Episcopalian and my father was Catholic, and he was determined I'd be baptized, a little Catholic baby. And my mother had agreed at that time. But my mother's middle name was Elizabeth, and she thought it was too long to write out. So there was a venerable great aunt in my family named Betty. And my grandmother, who died just before I was born, was Anne, and my father's sister was Anna. So they put the two together. No thought of Elizabeth Seaton. She wasn't on the horizon. So I don't know about other families. It just depends. But mine is a family name, but in community, as a daughter of charity, St. Elizabeth Ann Seaton is my patron. And I celebrate her feast day as, quote, my feast day, if you will.
BettyAnn, I have she's
Hi, Paul.
Hi. She's deceased now, but I had a cousin whose name was really Elizabeth Ann, but was called BettyAnn all her life.
Mm-hmm. She was lucky.
And I don't think it had anything to do with Elizabeth Ann Seaton either.
When my group received the habit, it was right after Vatican II, and it was a shocker for all of the community because we received our baptismal names. And the director wanted me to have Elizabeth, but the father director, the Vincentian, said, check her baptismal certificate and see what her name really is. So that's how I met Betty.
Yeah, I love the tradition. I love the tradition at Emmitsburg when they have the oldest Elizabeth Ann and the youngest Elizabeth Ann in procession at Mass.
That's at the National Shrine, yes.
Wonderful.
One of the celebrations. That is fun.
Sometimes it's a month-old baby, you know.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
It's great.
Awesome.
It's great to hear. It's great to hear about her again. Nobody knows her better than you do.
Thank you. Well, I know I went very quickly over a lot of information sequentially, so I don't know if there happen to be widows in the crowd or mothers or who may have questions from anything that I said.
Just feel free to unmute yourselves and
People also have the ability, if they go over to the reactions, to raise their hand, and she can call on you by seeing your little.
so, and I'll share a personal story, Sister BettyAnn, is that I didn't know as much about Elizabeth Ann Seaton as I've learned in recent years. I've been a Vincentian for about 10 years, but my mother actually passed away on January 4th.
Oh,
11 years ago now. And
Mhm.
so when I go to mass every year, I am
It's-
very much reminded, and
That's right.
and in a way, I've felt closer to Saint Elizabeth Ann Seaton because of that. So
Yes,
I feel
it's
my
a
mom's
feast of
hand is-
another mother.
Exactly. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
so I think we can just continue, and then if anyone has any other questions when we take another little reprieve. Oh, Michael, did you have a question?
Yes, I just wondered, when we were growing up and before Kennedy, and my understanding was back to the beginning, Catholics would be sort of second-class citizens compared to Anglicans or Episcopalians. Was that true that she not only, gave up friends and family maybe to convert, but her social status would have dropped a bit? Or is it different in the early 1800s?
That's a very, very astute question, because the New York City of that era, Lower Manhattan was pretty much all that was really populated, and that doesn't go up to beyond Central Park. And I'm not a New Yorker, but I know that's kind of in the middle. What was happening, the Irish were coming over and taking jobs, but they were working on the wharf, and they were considered they were the immigrants of the day, and they were looked down upon, and they were rough and ready. They were the Catholics of the day. There were a few families that were more genteel, shall we say, but Elizabeth makes a comment in one of her letters that she's really going to the Catholic Church for reasons of salvation and faith, not to socialize with the folks that are there. In other words, the social scene is not her goal. Now, you mentioned the Anglican. See, the Episcopal Church in the United States separated from the Church of England. So it very specifically in New York was the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States. What we know as High Church or Anglicanism had not yet come across the ocean, and the dogma of transubstantiation had not yet filtered, percolated up and over to the United States. So she was not in a high Episcopal church. She was in a regular Episcopal church with middle class and upper middle class folks at that time. And while she was attracted to Holy Communion of devotion as an Episcopalian, and used to go around to the different chapels that they had in little neighborhoods to receive communion on the monthly communion Sunday, she also went to listen to the sermon that was given because she liked the new preacher in town, Reverend Henry Hobart, who really is responsible for sparking the fire of divine love in her. That's when she really got energized and got religion, shall we say. So that's the state that she was in when she went to Italy. Does that answer a little bit, Michael? Does that clarify?
Great.
Do we need to take a 5-minute break, Claudia?
Yes, I would say that might be a good idea, everybody. So I see it's 6, let's come back at 6:45 and we'll get
Okay.
restarted. I'm going to pause the recording. We're going to get started again. And I will turn it back over to Sister BettyAnn.
Okay, let me see if I can get it back up now. Here we are, but wait just a minute, I'm on the wrong screen. What do I do to get myself back? There we go. Claudia, I might need your help here a minute.
Yes.
I have two screens and I only need to see one.
So if you go to the bottom where your little Zoom emblem is,
Yeah.
what comes up? If you just hover over it.
Video, participants.
No, on the bottom on your toolbar. If you hover over the little Zoom camera, do you see it?
Yes.
What comes? Does one of the screens you want to see come up?
Yes, but it's
Click.
on the one.
I can't see your video. Can you minimize? If you minimize your screen, it shouldn't affect what you're showing us or what you're seeing.
Okay, I think I just got it.
Okay.
Okay, how are we doing here? Am I visible? And you're
You're
hearing?
visible. Yeah, we can see you
Oh,
perfectly
this is-
well.
Okay, this is wonderful. Let there be.
Technology is not what it
Yes. So we've talked about the early youth and the initial years of Elizabeth Seaton as an adult. So she was widowed at age 29 with 5 children. And the great struggle that she had, aside from making the decision about religious conversion, was how could she support herself? Nobody wanted to hire her. Women didn't work outside of the home generally at that point in time. And everybody had an idea on what she should do. She learned that Mr. and Miss Patrick White were going to start a school, and they offered her a job as a teacher. Well, that was marvelous. And she was so happy, and she wrote all about it. Well, school hadn't started, and the contract had been just a few weeks in the making before Mr. White told her, actually on her birthday, that the school was going to go bankrupt. It wasn't going to work. And at that same time, her Episcopal former minister, Reverend John Henry Hobart, had been preaching to the congregation, don't send your children to Mrs. Seaton's. She'll be converting them. She'll be pushing Catholicism. So he really didn't help her at all in that sense. But the school went bankrupt and she really had no means of employment. A family friend suggested, well, actually her brother-in-law, who was a doctor, and his wife took her in for a short period of time, but they kind of lived far away from the Catholic Church. So it was hard for her to get to Mass. And in those days, she felt it was an extra expense for her sister to have to buy fish on a Friday. And Elizabeth was naturally, I guess, a thrifty woman, but she did not, and this is so human, she did not like to be dependent on someone. She had a sense of self-sufficiency to make it on her own. A family friend talked her into taking a job as what I would call a house mother for a group of boys who were boarders going to a school, an Episcopalian school. So she had about a dozen boys and paid rent and she provided for them, etc. So that was going along fairly well, except the boys started teasing her boys for being Catholic. And that didn't go over too well. And she handled some issue from a disciplinary viewpoint that the children complained to their mothers. And of course, you know, mothers, my little boy, my darling, would never do that. So some parents took the children out, they withdrew them, which meant that she was losing income. But at that time, and this is where the hand of God comes in so mysteriously, always in the background, but she was at Mass at St. Peter's Church. And she was invited to dinner at the home of a local Catholic couple that were friendly with her. And she used to go there and have breakfast with them. And there she met a priest who was traveling on his way to Boston, going through New York. And he was visiting with the Berries for an evening meal. And the way she tells the story, he says, well, tell me, Mrs. Seaton, tell me about your situation. And she kind of poured out that, oh, you know, I've been trying to get a job. I'd love to teach him, da, 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 da. And he just looked at her and he said, well, come to us. We'll help you formulate a plan of life. So that was Father William Dubourg, who later became the first bishop in St. Louis. And one thing led to another, and he went off to Boston and talked to the priest in Boston, whom she had been communicating with because the Faliki family had encouraged her to. And she had some wild idea of going to Canada because there was an Ursuline Academy, and she figured, well, maybe she could teach there and board, and the girls could go to school. And there was a Sulpician high school nearby, a boarding school. What she didn't know is that school had burned down, and the Ursulines didn't hire lay teachers. But the priests in Boston, Father Chevreuse and Father Francis Matignon, they wrote her and said, you know, we really think you should remain in the United States. And this plan, this idea of Father Dubourg sounds really good. You would do much more for the American Catholic Church remaining in the United States than if you went to Canada. So with that in mind, and Dubourg had talked to, when he went back to Baltimore, talked to his Sulpician confreres and got their support, and she consulted Bishop Carroll, and Bishop Carroll says, and this is real typical, well, I know Dubourg invited you. I don't know any of the details, but it's okay with me. I'm sure he'll fill me in when he can. So she and her daughters traveled by ship from New York down to Baltimore. In the meantime, the Falikis had arranged for the two boys to leave New York and go to Georgetown. We call it Georgetown University. It was a college, meaning a boys' boarding school. So they went there for 2 years. And as soon as she got down to Baltimore, they hired a carriage, rent a car is nothing new, and went down to Georgetown and picked up her two sons and came back, and the boys went to school at St. Mary's College, or boarding school, that Father Dubourg had started on the property of the Sulpicians. Some of you may be familiar with St. Mary's Seminary on Packer Street, Baltimore. This is the location that I'm speaking of. And the Sulpicians had a house right there on the edge of the property that was newly constructed. Nobody had lived in it. It still exists today and it's open for tours. It's a very quaint little house. But from going to, from basically apartment to apartment, one room, crowded conditions, she really felt she had arrived at a point of respectability, and they wanted the school to be small. She never had more than 10 pupils. that includes her daughters and 2 nieces of the Dubourg family, because Father Dubourg's sister was also there, a widow. So she began this school, which was really the intention of teaching Catholic girls in the faith, to form young Catholic girls to be good wives and mothers. There was education available for boys, for young men, but there wasn't Catholic education for girls. So that's what she was doing in Baltimore. And as time evolved, she felt that being next to the seminary and having the availability of the sacred liturgy, of Eucharistic adoration, it was just such a new experience for her, and so comforting and so consoling that she didn't have to fight anymore. She didn't have to worry. She was fully accepted. And the Sulpicians supported her and gave her discounts on, like they would buy food wholesale, etc. So life was good. And the Sulpicians got the idea that actually Dubourg had for 10 years. He had tried to get Ursulines to come to the United States, well, to Baltimore, really. And they didn't come, or they couldn't come. So there was this idea floating that was not uncommon in Europe. If you have a school, get some pious ladies together and form a community, and that creates a faculty and it regenerates itself. So this idea of a community life, a society dedicated to education was evolving. But Elizabeth, as a mother, her first and primary obligation was to her children. And the Sulpicians, who knew the Daughters of Charity in France, because the founder of Saint-Sulpice, Monsieur Ollier, was a friend of Vincent de Paul's, and the daughters were all over the place, visiting the sick and the poor, etc. But the Sulpicians were familiar with the concept of an apostolic society that was not cloistered. That was the key difference. And Mrs. Seaton seemed to buy into it. And all of a sudden, there's this young woman on the doorstep in early December saying, "I'd like to join with you." That was Cecilia O'Conway of Philadelphia. The Sulpicians were recruiting their directees, and Cecilia and another friend of hers were thinking about going to Europe to enter a convent because they didn't know of any in the United States. So 5 or 6 other women joined her in the Baltimore area, and the Sulpicians decided that they would purchase property. One of their seminarians was a retired sea captain, also a convert, but he had to dispose of his personal and accumulated wealth before he went on for the orders towards the priesthood. And he had it in his mind that he wanted to establish a continuum of services for the sick, the poor, the elderly, the needy, with a primary focus on education in the faith for girls. And he wanted Mrs. Seaton to be in charge. So Samuel Sutherland Cooper, the seminarian, donated, you will see that it's written $10,000, but the actual cost of the property was like about $6,000 or $7,000 when you get right down to it. But that was his donation, and he was a convert, and his family was not happy that he had done that, because his brother and family thought they should have that money. One thing led to another, but the Sulpicians came to Emmitsburg. They found a large piece of property of about 300 acres that was available, that had an old farmhouse on it, the old Fleming farmhouse. Then they purchased it with the intent that it was to be land for this community Mrs. Seaton was starting. And the seminarian, the donor, insisted that the location of the project he was funding would be in Emmitsburg, at Emmitsburg, Maryland, which is Frederick County. It's a northern part of Maryland. It's right by the Pennsylvania border. It's a stone's throw from Gettysburg. He insisted that it be there because the Sulpicians had begun a school a mile or two down the road, which we know as Mount St. Mary's Seminary and University today. Bishop Carroll was real upset because he thought the school was going to be in Baltimore. But God provided, and it was to be in Emmitsburg. And a couple of Mother Seaton's sisters-in-law, whom she had helped raise, came down to visit her. One of them was quite ill with the same tuberculosis, and they got a Conestoga wagon and went very quickly to the rural section of Maryland, thinking they could stay in the Fleming farmhouse, but it wasn't ready. It hadn't been rehabbed. It was truly an abandoned stone house made of stone. So Father John Dubois gave them hospitality up at Mount St. Mary's. He moved out of his cabin, let the women have it for 6 weeks. And as soon as the stone house was ready, the other group 2 from Baltimore came and brought her 2 sons and the rest of the women, and they united at the stone house on July 29th and marked the official founding of the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's on July 31st, 1809. That date may have been selected because it is the feast of St. Francis Xavier, who was the patron of the Maryland Jesuit missions. We don't know, but it is the founding date of the community, which is the first Native community or sisterhood for women established in the United States. It's an apostolic society. Its purpose was to honor Jesus Christ crucified and to teach the Catholic faith to girls. So Mother Seaton is really a pioneer Catholic educator, but her main contribution is free education for girls in the faith. She established St. Joseph's School, which had a dual program of, they called them day scholars. The children, the girls in the neighborhood came by day, and the sisters ran into financial problems because they weren't getting any incomes. They couldn't pay their bills. So then with the Sulpicians and Bishop Carroll putting their heads together, they invited some of the finer families of Maryland to send their girls there and pay tuition. So St. Joseph's School had a program for day hops, and it had a program for boarding students, and it also had cared for some orphans. And thrown in there over time, some widows lived there also. Before Elizabeth came to Emmitsburg, she wanted to consecrate herself to God. You hear about consecrated virgins today. Well, she made vows privately before Bishop John Carroll for 1 year as she embarked on this journey. And after the community was established and Father William de Bourgh was the first superior, did a draft of provisional rules as they waited for the French common rules of the Daughters of Charity to arrive by way of Bishop-elect Flagey, who had gone over to Paris and was commissioned to bring them back, and a young, fairly newly ordained priest came back with him, Father Simon Brute, who eventually became Mother Seaton's spiritual director and later the first bishop of Vincent's diocese. So when the rule came, Elizabeth Seaton looked at it. They made some revision for the American church, not to think of the post-Vatican II American church that you read about, but the new republic and how could this new land nurture Roman Catholicism and spread the faith. So there were some small adaptations made for that, and Elizabeth Seaton and the sisters listened to the rule as it was read after being translated and modified, and it went to the Sulpician Superior and Bishop John Carroll for approval. And so from 1812 on, they lived by that same rule, which is basically the Daughters of Charity rule. So as I said, Elizabeth Seaton was the first to really give life, to plant the mustard seed of the Vincentian charism in the United States. The young priest that had come over with Flagey, Father Brute, his aunt had been a Daughter of Charity, and he also was a scholar and a physician and a bibliophile. He collected books. So he provided Elizabeth Seaton with the French texts of Vincent's Conferences to the Daughters of Charity and the first life of Louise de Marillac, etc. And she translated those. She did selective translations and then used that for instruction for the sisters. That's how the charism was passed on and the seed was passed on. She was an educator. She was a school administrator, but she was also the spiritual leader of the Sisters of Charity. And the community was named Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's because they were located in a sub-valley of St. Mary's Valley. So the sisters named, Mother Seaton and the sisters named the sub-valley St. Joseph's Valley. So that's why the sisters are Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, of the place. Requests started coming in for assistance. And the first group of sisters that Mother Seaton sent forward to open a new mission was to Philadelphia to take over the management of an orphanage that a group of lay folks had started, but they had more than they bargained for. St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum was the first Catholic orphan asylum in the United States. It survived until social services and childcare changes of the last 50 years. Mother Seaton felt sorry for Father Dubois because he couldn't keep lay help. So she sent a group of sisters up there to manage the domestic services, the liturgical services, and the infirmary for the boys. And she was thrilled when there was a request that came from New York that she could send sisters to, quote, her native city. So the Roman Catholic Orphan Asylum of New York in 1817. So the community, the sisters spread outward, and that first generation of students that were at Mount St. Mary's, the first group of seminarians and the second group, from those classes came some of the earliest bishops of the United States. So they in their youth had known Mother Seaton, had known St. Joseph's. So they began asking for sisters in their diocese as they were made bishops. So the community grew and spread very, very quickly. And 1852 was the first request, or we went in response to a request to California. But it was 1828 when we opened the first Catholic hospital west of the Mississippi in St. Louis. So it's quite a missionary expansion is what came of the mustard seed. Now, I don't know if Claudia was able to retrieve the slide that I tried to send.
Unfortunately, sister, no, neither
No.
Stephen nor I got it. So,
Okay, okay. Well, let me just run through this. What I wanted to share with you,
do you want to share your screen?
I don't know if I can really get at it. How do I share my screen quickly?
Just at the bottom on the green button that says share screen.
Okay, let me see if I can pull that up.
Click on it and see if it lets you.
Yes, yeah, I see what you're saying. Okay. Okay, let me. That is not what you want to see.
So stop sharing and share something else.
Let's try, let me try this. This is like the pause that doesn't refresh, isn't it? It doesn't seem to be working satisfactorily. So,
Okay,
um,
I'll just stop sharing your screen then.
okay, thank you.
Uh,
Oh, I think I just found it.
Oh, okay, go ahead. If you found it, feel free to pop it back up, pop it up.
Okay, now get back to Zoom.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
We can.
Okay. Let me get this thing down. All right. Can the participants see this easily enough?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If you look in the center, what I tried to do graphically is to show how the Vincentian rule, the Vincentian family and rules originated. And I don't seem to know how to do a pointer. So look on your left, you see Europe. The first is Vincent de Paul, who began the Confraternities of Charity in 1617, then the Congregation of the Mission, Priests and Brothers, then Vincent and Louise together, it was really Louise primarily, established the Daughters of Charity in 1633. The Ladies of Charity, which was the special charity of Hotel Dieu, 1634. So those were the primary, the initial, and this is the birth of the Vincentian charism through Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. We wouldn't know Louise without Vincent, and we really wouldn't know the real Vincent without Louise. So it's the two together. Then 200 years later in Paris, Frederick Ozanam and his friends, he's considered the primary founder, established the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which you're very familiar with. what I want to show you is that of these groups in Europe, the rule of each of the main ones, Congregation of the Daughters of Charity and the Society of St. Vincent de Paul and Ladies of Charity, came from Europe to North America, part of God's plan. And it was Elizabeth Seaton. Whoop. Where did she go? Okay. It was Elizabeth Seaton who gave life to the Vincentian rule in North America in 1809. The Congregation of the Mission came in person, not just the rule, but in person in 1816. And almost 20 or 30 years later, the rule came to St. Louis, and you have the first gathering of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul with Brian Malenfi as the chair. And the first president was, I think, Mr. Litton. I have it written on another paper. And then another 10 or so years later, we have Catherine Harkins, who was educated by the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's, who began the Ladies of Charity in the United States in 1857. So that's how the rule organizationally came to be. But then if you look at Elizabeth Seaton, who, by the way, died in 1821, she founded the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph's. But after her death, there was some conflict with the bishop, can you imagine? And the Sisters of Charity of New York were established as a result in 1846. Then the Sulpicians could no longer be involved in the governing of the Emmitsburg Sisters of Charity. So in order to preserve the integrity of the charism, they were able to unite. In order for them to transfer the responsibility to the Congregation of the Mission, the Emmitsburg community united with the French Daughters of Charity in 1850. A group in the Sisters on Mission in Cincinnati didn't agree with that decision, said that Mother Seaton wanted an American community. She did. So they became an independent community under Bishop Purcell. And the New York Sisters sent sisters to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and that group became independent in 1856. Then Bishop James Roosevelt Bailey in New Jersey wanted Sisters of Charity for his diocese because he was the great nephew of Elizabeth Seaton. And so that group came to be in 1859. And the Cincinnati Sisters sent sisters to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and that became, in the Greensburg area, the Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill in 1870. So the mustard seed that Elizabeth Seaton planted multiplied. And these communities united in an effort to spur the canonization of Elizabeth Seaton and formed what we know today as the Sisters of Charity Federation, which also has additional communities that share the rule of Vincent, but they didn't come from the Elizabeth Seaton Foundation. So that's I hope, a graphically clear explanation of how are we alike and how are we different. We all share the same charism, but our purpose and our expression of it is unique according to the mission of each of the entities, the Congregation of the Mission, the Society, or the Ladies of Charity or the Sisters or Daughters of Charity. If you have questions on that, I would ask you to please put them in the chat and we will deal with them. Thank you for
I'm glad you found the graphic. That was great. That helped it explain it very well. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that we were able to do that. How are we doing on time right at this particular point? Okay.
You're great on time. So
I'm great on time. Okay. Well,
you're sharing your screen again?
no, I'm not
Sister-
intending to. We
Sister
do
Paul
not
is
want-
sharing her screen. Sister Paul, are you intending to share your screen? I'm going to say she's not.
I would think
Maybe
not too. No,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
She
So let
seems
me-
to be blanking out mine.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, well thank you. One never knows in this life, does one?
Who knew we'd all have to learn Zoom so well? Thought we'd be
Isn't
out
it
of
the
this.
truth?
Yeah, Sister Paul, you did want to say something, and did you want to share your screen?
Yeah, just to, maybe, I don't know, 5-7 years ago, I did a presentation in the college, which now is the University of the Sisters of Charity of Greensburg. And one of
Seton
those,
Hill. Mhm.
yeah, Seton Hill, one of those sisters told me that until very recently, they still made vows annually, privately, and renewable, exactly the way the Daughters of Charity make them. And it was later, much later, that they made the decision to make perpetual vows. But for most of their lives, they made them the same as we do. And they were a derivative.
Let me clarify that. I've lost my paper here. All of the communities started out as making annual vows.
Yeah.
Seton and her sisters made vows for the first time July 19th, 1813. And all of the communities did that. However, the codification of canon law of 1917 is what was interpreted by many local bishops, and the bishops insisted, enforced that those apostolic societies had to be canonical religious congregations in conformity to the new code of canon law, that there had never been a code of canon law before. So a lot of things changed as a result of that.
But I think what I'm saying is those sisters in Greensburg didn't do, I mean, they were still alive, some of those who made the, who were still making annual vows. And
Okay.
it might have just been that group for all I know, but
Yes,
that's what
yes.
you told me.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Are there any questions in this chat box before I move on?
There was. So now we know how, the Sisters of Charity. I got that straight because the graphic helped on that. But how many arms are there based on Vincent's rule? Both in, if you know, both in Europe or globally, as well as in the US.
Well, there is an international office of the Vincentian family that is online. When I did research about 25 years ago, it was 268 institutes that had Vincent as a patron, but that includes, that's a historical figure and includes those that were founded that way. That doesn't include those that are still viable today. So I would suggest that you go to it's called Vincentian Family website, International Vincentian Family. And I know that they have statistics and they have a database, et cetera. I really don't know off the top of my head exactly what the number is, but it is in the hundreds, I think. Because the research I did was not just on religious congregations, it was on lay organizations also, and non-Catholic ones, meaning primarily Anglican.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. And I'm gonna, just for everyone, I'm gonna put the link to the FamVin or the address for the FamVin in the chat. So,
Okay, it's really the International Vincentian Family Office, and I don't know if that comes directly under FamVin right now.
it does. That's what comes up.
Okay.
Yeah. yeah.
Okay, okay. All right, let me just get myself right back to where I was before we started sharing the screens. Okay. Well, I'm glad that graphic worked out okay and that you could see it, because sometimes a picture is worth, you know, more words, 1,000 words, et cetera, et cetera. What I think it would be best to do is to take questions from the floor before we move into more of a discussion of Mother Seaton and her as a saint and her spirituality, etc.
Oh,
We looked at the human side of her, and we've looked at the service side. I mean, that's what I was trying to emphasize the last 15 minutes or so, and how her mustard seed, or Vincent and Louise's mustard seed, have germinated and spread. So if there are questions, I'd be glad to try and respond to them at this point.
well, Stephen has a question. I see his hand up.
Okay, go for it.
Stephen, you're muted. For some reason, you're not muted, but we can't hear your sound.
Hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sister, I just thought it was really interesting when you were talking about sort of the coincidences that really turned out to be God's hand
Yes.
bringing Elizabeth Ann Seaton and almost moving her towards sainthood from the very beginning. You know, just they seem like random occurrences, but it really does turn out to be God's moving kind of the church in a direction, in a way.
Mhm.
Do you have a comment on that, or?
There's nothing coincidental in life. Elizabeth Seaton believed in divine providence as an Episcopalian. She had a relationship with God. I mean, she didn't get fired up until Hobart appeared on the scene in the early 1800s, but she really had a conviction about divine providence. And yes, divine providence acts, and acts through events and circumstances.
Can I ask a personal question?
You can try.
So how has the experience of Elizabeth Ann Seaton's divinity and that history and that connection with providence influenced your life?
Well, I would say it's the connection of Elizabeth Seaton's sanctity, not her divinity.
Right, sanctity, sorry.
Her relationship with the divine. The experience of living and walking on her grounds for so many years, and the hands-on experience as an archivist of working with her letters and working to publish them, and sometimes just trying to read her handwriting. She was consistently inconsistent in her spelling patterns, but in those days, there were no standards for punctuation and spelling. So that's kind of challenging in itself. I think I've always seen myself not like her, but having had similar experiences or been in similar circumstances, to have the same desire to know God's plan and do God's will, which was a driving force in her life, very much so. Sometimes one needs to take action or feels moved to make a decision or to do something. And it's only through prayer and discernment that one has the courage of faith to move forward. And I think Elizabeth Seaton had to make a lot of hard decisions, and she had to deal with relationship issues too. She and the second superior didn't get along at all. They were like at loggerheads. And the first superior, she didn't like a decision that he made, and she mentioned it to Bishop Carroll. She wasn't trying to go over his head, but that's how he interpreted it. Carroll was her friend. So we all do have contacts and experiences with people with, as you could say, sandpaper personalities. Everybody in the workplace isn't as congenial as we'd like them to be.
Not at St. Vincent, not at St.
That's right.
Vincent. There's no sandpaper at St. Vincent.
Really? Oh, you mean St. Vincent Parish or St. Vincent de Paul?
St. Vincent de Paul, of course.
Oh, well, we can talk about that later. Yeah, I don't know that he always got along with the ladies that he needed to get their jewels from, but he knew how to persuade them. He was very persuasive.
I think that's sort of a comment in Michael. Michael, you have your hand up?
It's actually Lupe, my wife.
Oh, Lupe.
Yes. I'm just curious. Did you know how old was she when she became a widow? And also, how high her education were, because she was able to teach.
Yes.
And if any of her children follow her vocation?
Thank you, Lupe. Those are really good questions. Your first question was how
old was she when she became widowed?
okay, thank you. She was 29 when she was widowed, 29. And her level of education, my colleagues who have studied the education field and read about women of that era believe that she was extremely literate among women of better society. For her father being a doctor, they must have had some books available. There's school books that she's written in that a lot of Greek mythology and historical ancient history things that frankly I wouldn't have expected. But she was very well educated for that era. Now, we do not know that she went to any particular school. We just don't know. She mentions Mama Pompilione, but we've never been able to figure out if that's a dame school and the correct spelling for that woman's name. I mean, even through ancestry.com and the National Archives. So we really don't know how far she got in education because they didn't have elementary schools, secondary, and college. Probably in addition to her basic education, she was a reader and she was a member of the library and she took out books. So there's a lot of self-education, and perhaps the Seaton family may have had books, but then as a mother, how much time did she have to read? When she was in Baltimore, she does talk about a couple of the seminarians coming over and tutoring her in mathematics and arithmetic. So that might not have been a strong point in growing up, but she does take over the job as treasurer for the Widows Society, and she takes it over for the sisters at one point when the treasurer is not well and able to do it. So there's no definitive answer as to how high her education was compared to our standards, but she was very literate for a woman of her day. And she was the daughter of a doctor. So, I mean, he was educated, and her brother-in-law was also a doctor, et cetera. And she had an uncle that was a doctor and a grandfather that had been an Episcopalian priest. Did any of the children follow? Let me just say very simply that the first child, Anina, that did go to Italy with them, she was very bright, and she was in Emmitsburg as a teenager and was actually doing some tutoring, and you'd call it teacher aid, but unfortunately she had the TB predisposition, and she died at age 16 of TB and is buried at Emmitsburg. That broke Elizabeth's heart. Her next child, William, we'll come back to. His brother, the baby that had a difficult birth, Richard Bailey, his full name, Richard Bailey Seaton. He had trouble in school. He wasn't academically inclined, and he went to learn accounting at the Felici House, and he didn't do well in that. He had a business venture in Baltimore that didn't work out. So he wanted to go on the high seas like his brother did. He got a job as a civil servant, as a clerk to the captain, and off the coast of Africa, he went to visit or help take care of a man that was ill, and that was the first American consul of Liberia. Richard began feeling poorly and went back to his ship and died and was buried at sea at age roughly 25 or 26. The next child was Catherine Josephine. She was actually named after the baby sister and the mother of Elizabeth Seaton. She was a very bright, articulate child and had a lot of, I would say, allergies, seasonal allergies, and her mother used to send her to stay with the family that they were friends with that didn't live in the valley. And she was she taught at St. Joseph's, and she was very smart, and she was the only child there when her mother died. And she lived with her brother in his family and toured Europe several times with him. And finally, midlife, decided she was going to do something meaningful with her life. And Archbishop John Hughes was bringing the Sisters of Mercy into New York, and she became first American postulant of the Sisters of Mercy and served in prison ministry at Sing Sing for 45 years. And she died at the tender age of 91 after her mother taking such good care of her health as a little one. Then the youngest child, Rebecca, was just a little toddler as everything was evolving around her, and she grew up at St. Joseph's. And while her mother was taking care of the oldest one who was dying, little Rebecca was out playing with the children and was playing in an area that was iced over because there was a creek through the property. And she fell and hurt her hip and didn't tell her mom. Consequently, the child became lame and it became tubercular, and she died at age 14. So Mother Seaton buried 2 of her own children and 18 young sisters and her 2 sisters-in-law at Emmitsburg in the 12 years that she was there. Her second born, William, he did not want to be a businessman. He didn't have any sense for it. He wanted to be on the high seas. Excuse me. So Elizabeth pulled as many strings as she could and got an appointment for a lieutenant. And he became, he sailed with the United States Navy and retired finally as a lieutenant. He had married a wealthy woman, so they did a lot of European travel, but he lived into early 70s and died in New York. And he and some of his children are buried at Emmitsburg at Mount St. Mary's. And he gave money for a small mausoleum for his mother, and that is today at Emmitsburg known as the Mortuary Chapel, where Elizabeth Seaton was initially buried, and her half-nephew, James Roosevelt Bailey, is buried in the original cemetery. And all of those women that died there and her children, they're all buried there in the original cemetery, which is a very sacred place to visit. Does that help with that question that you had, Lupe? I hope so.
Absolutely.
Any other questions before we take a little break?
Yes, there was one question. I think it was Katie DiMartini.
Yes.
Katie, can you unmute yourself? You have to click the unmute button.
Okay, now do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I was wondering about the Sisters of Charities that came to San Francisco about 1850. I had the Sisters of Charity in grammar school and high school in San Francisco. And I believe they told us they came and helped San Francisco start the first hospital in San Francisco.
Well, that's right. They had the big white coronet.
Yes.
Yeah, they were called daughters. They were called Sisters of Charity, but they are daughters of charity.
Okay.
Yes, correct. They
and-
came from the East Coast, from Emmitsburg, by way of New York on a ship through the Isthmus of Panama that you had to walk across.
Okay.
Traveling with them were some Army people, a young colonel, I think he was, named Ulysses Grant. You may have heard of him. And as they crossed the Isthmus of Panama, a number of them, both of the soldiers got ill, and two of our sisters died crossing and buried there. And then they came around into San Francisco in 1852, I think it was.
What's the difference between the daughters and the sisters?
Well, that's what I was explaining with the chart.
Okay.
Communities that came from the Mother Seaton Foundation are Sisters of Charity.
Okay.
Emmitsburg, some of the Emmitsburg community united with France, which is officially Daughters of Charity. But before Vatican II, the Daughters of Charity used the term Sisters of Charity all the time. Colloquial, so.
Okay.
So, Sister BettyAnn, the Sisters of Charity, was it the sisters that participated in caring for the soldiers in the Battle of Emmitsburg?
It was the Daughters of Charity. It was the Battle of Gettysburg.
Gettysburg?
Several hundred of us that were nurses on the battlefields, and there's some books about it. But the Sisters of Charity of New York also had a hospital in New York in an area which I think is Central Park now. And they actually cared for Mother Seaton's grandson. He was comatose, and a sister was standing there when he came to, and he kind of looked at her and she said, "Son, what's your name?" And he kind of looked at her and said, "Oh, you must have known my grandmother." Well, who was your grandmother? He said, "Elizabeth Seaton." And they took good care of him. She had 2 grandsons in the Civil War. But no, those were, and then the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati also did nursing in the Allegheny area in Cumberland, Maryland. There were a lot of religious women that did nursing during the Civil War.
Sister, we've got about 14 minutes left.
For the total thing,
Yes.
Yes.
well, we didn't have our second break. How can we live without that?
I think we can.
Okay. Let's move on then, if there's not another specific question. Look at Mother Seaton as we know her today. We know that she is a saint in heaven. The role of a saint is as intercessor and model. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. As a model, she can be a model for anyone. Her spirituality was rooted in the Protestant Episcopal Church, but rooted in the Word of God and the Eucharist as she understood it then, and in the real presence as she understood it as a Roman Catholic. Her personality and her way to God was relational. It was not so much I, thou, as with friends and with a relationship with God. Her focus was to do the will of God. And she knew, how could she fail in this Baltimore enterprise if her whole purpose is just to do the will of God? I mean, that's basically what she said. I've mentioned how she was rooted in divine providence early on. The works of mercy came natural to her because she had experienced that through the ministry of her, or the professional service of her father, the ministry of her grandfather. So as a good Christian woman, why wouldn't you go to the bedside of your dying stepmother if she asked you to? What would keep you back from that? And at that time, when she was caring for her, despite all that had gone on earlier, they were reconciled, which is a very consoling thing. Her stepmother did teach her prayers as a little child, and Psalm 23 was her favorite throughout life. And she mentions that several times. The Eucharist was like a magnet for Elizabeth Seaton in Italy. She had never seen a Catholic Mass. She had never seen Eucharistic procession. She had never seen adoration. That was really a magnet. But I think really her prism of faith came through her newly acquired friendship and understanding of who Mary was as the Mother of God. In Italy, she came across by chance a prayer book that was open to the Memorare. And she, who had lost her mother as a little child, just was so touched by it that she made 3 copies of it. And at the bottom of one says, "Love me, my mother." I just think that's very, very touching. And so as a woman, she also wrote and reflected meditatively on the experience of maternity of Mary as the mother of Jesus and what it must have been like to care for a newborn and breastfeed him and raise him, etc. She was very strong as a convert, as someone who had really paid a high price to become a Catholic. She advised her sisters on her deathbed to be daughters of the church, which really meant to be loyal, to be true believers. she expressed that religion was her greatest consolation, and her faith and her devotion meant everything to her. It was her source of consolation. She who had lost so very much in life. When she died at age 46 of tuberculosis, there was a sense of her personal holiness. Bishop Carroll mentioned at one time, Father Dubois, Father Brute, he wrote out and told the sisters not to destroy anything because sometime these papers are going to be valuable. And they certainly proved valuable when it came around to cause for canonization. It was just by chance that the cause was introduced. Archbishop Gibbons was saying mass in the mortuary chapel on the 5th anniversary of Archbishop Bailey's death, and all the sisters were standing around, and after mass, the Archbishop looked at the sisters and said, you know, I was thinking, we don't have a saint yet in the United States. Do you think Mother Seaton could be the first American saint? And he looked out in the crowd and he said, and you, Sister Martha, you knew her, you lived with her. You could give testimony. And that informality, that was the beginning of the cause for canonization in 1882. Took a long time to get the documents copied. We didn't have computers and we didn't have barely typewriters at that point. But eventually the cause was officially introduced and there were miracles. Sister Gertrude Kortzendorfer, who was on mission in New Orleans, was cured of pancreatic cancer. She was in her 60s and lived another 20 years or so. Ann O'Neill is a woman in Baltimore who was my age, a mother, grandmother, retired beautician. She was cured of leukemia at age 4. And a Protestant man who did become Catholic later, Eric Carl Kalin of New York, had about 5 diagnostic categories and he was cured. So together, those 3 miracles were accepted for the canonization. And the Pope laughed and said, you know, the 4th miracle will dispense with. The Sisters of Charity are all working together, and that's a miracle. So she was canonized on September 14th, 1975, the first canonization where the people in the plaza had chairs to sit on. And I was there. If you look at a photo, 24th row, 4th one in. We've talked about the Sisters of Charity Federation that really did plan and participate in the canonization. But Mother Seaton's legacy of charity lives on today at the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seaton. And I would suggest if you haven't had a chance to at least visit their website and take advantage of some of the experiences that they are offering now virtually. It is a place of beauty. It is on the holy grounds where Elizabeth Seaton lived and walked. It seems to me that her legacy of charity is something for all ages. Saints are virtuous people who we can imitate regardless of our age or role. And I think Elizabeth Seaton's life experiences are what so many of us can resonate with, whether it's a sick child, a sick relative, loss of a parent, loss of a loved one, incapacity, terminal illness. That's the human condition. She's a story, she herself is a story of survival for emotional orphans of the living, rejected children, troubled adolescents, young adults dealing with emotional problems and addictions. Spouses and parents understand her determined faithfulness in dealing with financial and family issues, terminal illness, and concern about their offspring's future and stability and education. Big, big thing. And Elizabeth Seaton understands grief. Very much so. One maxim I'd like to just share with you, since Sister Paul shared her little story. One of Elizabeth's maxims was, take every day as a ring, which you must engrave, adorn, and embellish with your actions, to be offered up in the evening at the altar of God. So we started off talking about Elizabeth Seaton as a friend, and we conclude with thinking of friendship and the ring of friendship. So I hope that this time this evening has given you some new insights into Elizabeth Seaton as a Vincentian woman, but as a model and an intercessor and someone who understands life as we live it. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you so much for joining us, and what a gift to have you. What a privilege it is to have you. Would you like to, do you have a closing prayer that you could leave us with? It can be off the top of your head. You don't have to read it.
Yes. We ask you, Lord, to bless all of the folks who have joined us tonight in the Vincentian family to learn more about how we can imitate Elizabeth Seaton, who believed that every good work we do is a grain of seed for eternal life. And we ask you to bless those who are without food and fuel and shelter this evening, and those without hope, to bring them consolation and relief, and good people to assist them in their need. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Sister.
You're very welcome.
What a
Thank you, sister.
You're very welcome. Nice being with y'all.
Yeah.
Be safe.
Way past your bedtime. So
It is
thank
past
you.
your
I do
bedtime.
have to ask a question. The cross on your wall behind you.
Well, the cross on my wall, that is a piece of driftwood I picked up at the Atlantic seashore where I grew up. I've had it for about 25 or 30 years. You know, Gifts from the Sea, Anne Lindbergh's book has always spoken to me because I'm a kid from the beach. I grew up at the beach. So that's what the cross is.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
lovely.
And thank you
It's a
for
gift
sharing
of
your
the sea.
time and your talents with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for
so
the
much,
opportunity.
sister. Thank you.
God
Thank you.
bless you
God bless
all.
you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us tonight for Tuesday with Vincent DePaul. And this is actually the last Vincent DePaul for a while. And I think we could not have picked a better ending to this entire series. Thank you, Sister BettyAnn McNeil,
You're
for
very
all of
welcome.
your time and all your effort. And I know how much you put into this. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for all your support and help.
Thanks, Betty. Ann.
Okay.
Great as
Bye.
always.
Nice to see you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all for
Night.
coming.
Safe travels.
Thank
Yeah.
you, sister.